John Colborn, thank you so much for joining us today. I've had the pleasure of knowing you now for probably what, two and a half years?
Yeah, 2 years. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Congratulations on your new anniversary with Apprenticeships for America. And as executive director for this organization, you get to help set the direction and work with all of the members on where are apprenticeships for America going? What does the landscape look like? And you get the unique inside perspective of kind of all ranges, for-profit to nonprofit, government to private industry. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Me too.
So, John, can you, as we're having coffee and just kind of kicking this off, can you give me a little bit of background on sort of the evolution that you've seen in apprenticeships over the last couple of years to where we are today?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. And really happy to be here. I love being part of these conversations. Love the way you've set this up. So let me just say, apprenticeship is, of course, a very, very old idea. And some of the forefathers of this country were involved as apprentices in their professions. But it sort of entered a modern age, I guess you would say, in the Depression, when the National Apprenticeship Act was passed. And there was an official federal framework for apprenticeship in the United States. It turns out that since then, apprenticeship has flourished, but only in one industry. And that industry is our skilled trades industry. So when you talk to people about apprenticeships, when I say I work for an organization called Apprenticeships for America, the first thing they think about is, carpenters and plumbers and
Union.
all the folks who come in and fixed my house or built my house or built the school next door. Those are the folks who are in apprenticeship. And that popular perception is not wrong. That is the lion's share of where we've done our work in apprenticeship. And we've actually built that apprenticeship because of a public policy that was passed many decades ago that set up a tiered wage system for all construction projects that use any kind of federal money. So that
Apprentices are there in the US right now?
so right now there are about 625,000 apprentices in the United States. Each year, about 220 plus 230,000 apprentices enter the system. Because apprentices in some professions last longer than a year, that's why you see a slightly larger number of apprentices than enter the apprentice world every year. About half of those right now that are entering the apprenticeship world are entering into those skilled trades. But the real story, and this is the story of the last decade, is that apprenticeship has grown outside of the skilled trades. And so it's still a pretty small part of our total workforce. And relative to other countries, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in a little bit, we are just at the very beginning of our apprenticeship path. The truth is that what we have shown in the last 10 years is that organizations like Apprenti and many others have identified opportunities to use this model which is proven with lots of study to be among the most effective workforce development strategies that's out there. Highest wages, great retention, a great return on investment for employers that participate in apprenticeship, that have been able to use that model in many, many different contexts, in healthcare and education and information technology, in services industries, business services, accounting, marketing. A whole range of different occupations have started to experiment with and use apprenticeship as a way to build the talent ranks for their industry.
Well, and let's be clear, it exists in other industries in the United States. We just don't call them apprenticeships, right? Like
that is also true. So we have a
in law, you're a resident in medicine, but that's effectively just an apprenticeship under a different name.
Yes, and with some important differences, I will also say,
Sure,
but
sure.
yes, for sure, the practical learning that is implied in apprenticeship is something that lots of people have found that there's need for that, and there are structures for pursuing that in their industries. That's absolutely right.
So as we look at the US, and I agree with you completely, and when Apprenti speaks about apprenticeship, we're speaking kind of writ large that every industry and other parts of the globe use apprenticeship. So whether it's financial services or healthcare, IT, et cetera. And so we like to speak about the ubiquity of it as a
Yeah.
system. Why is it that other parts of the globe are doing it and have been for as long as we have? Just they do it in every sector, whereas the US sort of got stymied into that one
This
industry.
one case. I think there's a couple of different reasons for it, but the biggest, and we've studied this, we've looked at other countries. The biggest is that the United States has simply never invested in apprenticeship.
Mm,
In the 1960s, when we were starting to reconsider the way people get prepared for jobs post high school, we made a decision as a country that everyone should go to college. We
mhm,
passed a National Higher Education Act. We invested significant resources in that process. We expanded community colleges. We created student finance systems. We expanded Pell Grants. We did a lot to do that, to expand this idea of getting everyone to go to college. And lo and behold, we've come to a place where maybe that has reached some limits. What we know is a lot of people end up in college who don't complete college. A lot of people don't think they want to go to college and don't feel like they have alternatives. And so I think we're at a time where the discourse is ripe for bringing apprenticeship back into the conversation
mhm.
as one of those pathways that people can look at after they graduate from high school.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I think that there are lots of reasons why people choose not to go to college. And in addition to the fact that some people, it's just not their learning modality, right? It's just not the
Absolutely.
way they would prefer a hands-on environment.
Yeah.
Um,
But it's
but
expensive. It can be
right.
full time, and I have other things I need to do in my life, like raise a family or whatever. There's many reasons why it's just not the right solution for everyone.
But the interesting thing is now that, to your point, we're 10 years into this idea of expanding into the non-traditional sectors as they've been defined, meaning the non-building trades,
Right.
which last I checked is 95% of the country. It is interesting that in Europe, it's 30 and 70%. 30% go to university, 70%
Yep.
don't, but then take these kind of alternative, what I call vocational paths, right?
Yeah,
The
exactly.
apprenticeship path into the same industries, just through a different learning system. That is exactly the same ratio in the United States, just with no secondary pathway,
Yeah.
right? For the
Yeah, you're exactly right. We end up with about 30% of folks with the college degree. And then we tried to cram everybody else into that system with, predictable results. Um,
right. So are we seeing a an immediate acceptance to this? Like the idea should be just that obvious, right? Particularly
yeah. So,
with the number
plenty
of
of
people.
headwinds.
Yeah.
Plenty of headwinds on this conversation. I mean, interestingly, and we've just done a little paper on looking at sort of what do Americans think about apprenticeship.
Mhm.
And we're finding in public polling, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years after the COVID epidemic, that people have really started to focus on apprenticeship as an alternative, or apprenticeship and other vocational pathways as an alternative to college. And interestingly, we're seeing that among parents, among young people. There's a wide range of folks who seem to be starting to think about these alternatives. But the truth is that our entire post-secondary educational preparation career launch system is still very much rooted on going to college. If you go to a counselor office in high school, they're basically equipped to advise you on going to college. They're not really very much equipped to talk to you about an apprenticeship program or other sorts of pathways. Few starting to get there, but that's not their major approach. And in our popular culture, there's still a sense that if you're not getting a college degree, you are, and that is, we still have to fight that for sure.
Mhm.
And then I'll just say, I think we live in a country where most policymakers not only went to college and got college degrees, but also went to fairly traditional colleges, 4-year residential colleges, full-time, all of that sort of thing. And so that's very much rooted in the psyche of a lot of the decision makers we have in Congress and legislatures, in, the federal government. And so, breaking through that has also been a challenge. But as I say, I think there's pretty widespread understanding that we've reached some limits about this college for all approach that we've taken, the college debt that people are taking on, the poor results that people are ending up with, even when they get college degrees. And frankly, the need in a labor market for different kinds of preparation paths has gotten people to think about apprenticeship and these other non-college career preparation paths as something we ought to be exploring more fully.
Well, it's interesting. We've got, at least in my world, I have over 50,000 people who have applied. And that's just from me talking about it, right? My organization talking about it, which means that the consumer side of this equation is getting there a lot faster in the understanding that there are other ways to get into some of these better skilled careers. And it's easy to poke a prod into the building trades and say, that system doesn't work, or that system has this blue collar persona to it that all of these other sectors don't have. And so people are having a hard time linking the two together. But the reality is whether it's the building trades, it's healthcare, or it's IT, the apprenticeship system is leading to basically similar financial outcomes as the college degrees. And in some cases, even better.
Yeah, and as you say, with learning modalities that work for certain people who just don't like the classroom experience, that provides people with a paycheck rather than, a student loan that you have to repay, and that accelerates people towards their professional goals in a way that college doesn't. And one of the things we're seeing is that having pushed this college for all approach for so long, we find that people end up in jobs that actually never required a college degree in the first place. So why did I go to 4-year college? Even when you go as far as 10 years out from graduation, we find there's still a very large number of people who went to all this trouble of getting a college degree for a job that didn't require it. And that's just a huge waste of time and resources, energy. If we can find ways to accelerate pathways for those folks directly into experiential learning like apprenticeship, we just save a lot of trouble for a lot of people.
So spinning that, two sides of the equation, we know the consumer side of this is getting it a little bit faster and interested in the alternative, right? Because they can get to an outcome faster that has a good, strong financial result for them. The other side of the equation is the employers have to come, because the synonymous point is that this is a culture shift for American society to think beyond college as the requirement for everything. What do we call it? The paper ceiling, right? The artificial inflation of the degree requirement to all jobs in most of these sectors that require a skill. What is it that we have to do differently to get companies to see this? Because they feel the pain. They've been complaining about not having enough talent in all of these sectors for some time. What's going to change, or what's going to get them to change?
Yeah. I mean, for all its problems, I mean, one thing about the college degree, the college sort of industrial complex, is it is a system, right? And it's understandable, and you sort of know how to work with it, and you know what a college degree is, and when somebody gets a college degree, you kind of have a sense. It may not be the right sense, but you may have a sense of what's involved in getting that degree. So, and employers need systems. They need systems to hire people. You can't do this sort of bespoke every single time. I think one of the challenges we've had in breaking through that paper ceiling and trying to go to skills-based hiring approaches is that there's no ready system that employers can just sort of connect to and say, okay, I'm going to do that. So even when many employers have expressed an interest in moving to skills-based hiring. They don't have the mechanism to be able to do that. They don't have a credentialing process or a way of finding people in those roles for those roles. And so I think one of the things that makes apprenticeship somewhat preferential is that there is, for better or for worse, we have systems around it. They could be better systems, that's for sure, but we do have systems around it and ways to connect. I think the larger question is, why are employers not beating a path to apprenticeship right now? And I have a board member who has a saying. He says apprenticeships are sold, not bought, which is to say that an employer on their own is very unlikely to just say, oh, I'm going to set up an apprenticeship program. I'm going to fill out the paperwork. I'm going to create the training program. I'm going to put into place a mentor. I'm going to create the competency standards that people are going to work their way through. I'm going to design the wage progression. I'm going to have a mentor. If you ask an employer to do all that, the employer's going to say, you know what, I got a business to run. I'm going to focus on my business. I just don't have time for it. And so that's the beauty of organizations like Apprenti. And we think we need, Apprenti times 1,000 in this country.
Mm-hmm.
We need a lot of organizations that can be the easy button for apprenticeship, that can go to the employer with a solution. And they can know everything's been taken care of. I don't have to worry too much about all that other stuff. I maybe have to sign a document and maybe do a little bit of work back in the shop, but most of that's going to be handled by Apprenti. And the other thing that Apprenti does that's so important is you knock on a lot of doors, because apprenticeship is sold, not bought. And so you really need to be out there in front of employers, presenting this as an alternative, as an approach to building skills. We know the return on investment is there when an employer says yes, but it takes that easy button to make it easier, and it takes someone putting the idea in front of them before they'll be able to do that.
So how do we get it to scale? Because you're right, it's a sell, it's not a buy. And I will tell you that I think from where this started 10 years ago, because that's when Apprenti started too, was this idea that there's a little bit of the try before you buy. So let's try a lot of these programs. That's great. Yep. We've survived and made it 10 years and scaled. But now there's this, right, in the startup world, the challenge now is companies trying to figure out how to consolidate that, or that next step of how do we get them out of the idea that doing anything related to skills-based hiring is purely a CSR project.
Yeah, exactly. This is a charity thing.
Versus, no, this should be treated equitably with your interns, your early skills hiring. You should be doing this on scale in the hundreds annually if you're an enterprise. And if you're not an enterprise, it should just be part of your standard recruitment system.
The way you hire. Yeah, absolutely. So I would say two things on that. The first is we've actually looked at other countries that have grown their apprenticeship systems. So there's England and France and Australia are three countries that at one point did not have very robust apprenticeship systems. They're kind of like the U.S. It wasn't as concentrated in the skilled trades, but a sort of a small niche practice, let's just say. And those are countries that made a decision, in the case of England, around year 2000, in the case of England, much more recently, in like 2010 or so, that they would build up their apprenticeship systems. And what did they do? Well, the first thing they did is they said, we're going to have to spend some money on this. So they made a financial commitment to do that. Different financing approaches in each country. We can go into details if you're interested. But and then the other thing they did is they did something really smart with that financing. They said, we want to make sure that financing is creating a business model for all those organizations that can be the easy button for apprenticeship. And they deliberately structured a financing system that made organizations like Apprenti possible in France and England and Australia. And they also invested in, and in some ways it became, it sort of emerged an ecosystem to support all those organizations with, financing mechanisms and talent mechanisms and technologies and a variety of different things that make for a vibrant business sector. And when you do all of that, when you've got the organizations, you've got the financing, and an emerging cultural expectation around apprenticeship as an alternative to college, then you can get to scale. And that's the roadmap that the United States needs to get on if we're going to grow apprenticeship.
So we've got a culture shift amongst the populace to move beyond the idea that college is for everybody.
Underway, but yes,
right?
It's still work to do. Yep.
We've got an education system that needs to shift to
lots of work there.
This. A lot of work there. Then you brought up funding. There's state-sponsored funding, and I happened to be in Australia on vacation a few years back when they made an announcement that we were flying out of Brisbane, and we saw on the cover of the paper that that state within Australia was going to invest 175 million in expanding tech or expanding apprenticeship into non-traditional sectors, focusing on tech and healthcare. Now, the interesting part to that is $175 million in that state. That state is 5 million people.
Right.
This is a country of 335 million people that gets about the same economic benefit of 175.
And that was the expansion, right? There was a base below that, right?
That's right.
So this is, Australia is perhaps the poster child for this. They really spend a lot of money on apprenticeship, something like on a per capita basis. I think they spend like 170 times what we spend here in the United States. But we don't have to go to that extreme. There are countries like England and France that are more at the 20 to 40 or 50 times what we spend. And that sounds like a lot. If you look at our entire financing system for post-secondary education, we're not needing anything near what we're currently spending on a college for all policy that's getting us very limited results. Well,
and now, just because I like to conflate things, just one step further, what a pain in the what I am. So I just looked the statistic up, and the data was only there through 2022-23 academic year. But in the United States, the average amount of scholarship or funding provided per student in this country at the 4-year level was just a hair over $10,000 per student annually. What's the cost of an apprenticeship training?
Cost of it. It's wildly different in different industries, right? But it's not $10,000. It doesn't have to be.
Right. It doesn't have to be, and it depends on the role.
It depends on the role, and
some higher, some lower.
Yeah, and of course that's scholarship, right? That's just the public sector component. And we know apprenticeship is funded in multiple ways. One statistic we have
for 4 years, so they're really getting $40,000.
$40,000 a year, $10,000 a year,
total.
Yeah. And one thing we've assessed that the college student gets about 1,000 times what an apprentice gets in terms of public support. And you might say, okay, college costs a little bit more, but 1,000 times more? I don't think so. So we clearly have an imbalance in the way that we think about funding this work in simply an equitable distribution of how we think about our post-secondary educational funding resources. So a lot does come down to money. There's just no getting around it. If you don't invest, you're just not going to get the outcomes. But we also know that a big part of what we need is to be able to have organizations like Apprenti out there on the front lines that can make sure that as we put this money out there, we've got organizations that can really put that to good use. And that's the other piece of our role at Apprenticeships for America, is to build a community of practice around that whole function.
And I appreciate the push for Apprenti because we're here. But the reality is, and even when I'm speaking, I mean, it's us, it's HCAP, it's JFF, which is Jobs for the Future, right? It's all of these organizations and we all serve different parts of industries and
Yeah.
sectors
Yeah, for
that
sure you're not alone. Yeah.
no, and this is a rising tides conversation, right? This
We
is
think
not
so.
a competition, it's a co-opetition, and sometimes we help each other because we all have to get to the same end goal. So what's the tipping point? Do
Yeah.
we have a number for getting to a tipping point? Because I keep hearing a number, but it's such a small number. The number I hear is 2% of the population. And I'm like, that's a whopping 6 million people in a country of 330 doesn't seem like much. But when
It,
we're only starting at 650,000, as you said earlier, is
yeah.
that enough?
So we at Apprenticeships for America, we've set a goal that we should grow our apprenticeship system eightfold over the next 10 years. And if
Okay.
we did that, we would look like England. We'd look like France. We'd look like Canada. We'd look like Australia.
Okay.
Um, and we think that that number is rooted in a couple of key things. So first off, we've just done the occupational analysis. We know we know just looking at occupations that are apprenticeable, that is to say, don't require the college degree, it's a pretty easy lift to get to that eightfold increase. But the other thing we looked at is how about for people coming into the labor market or who are switching jobs in the labor market? Do we have enough people to fill apprenticeships if we look at that? And at that eightfold increase, we are starting to position apprenticeship as a truly legitimate alternative to college.
Mhm.
So when a young person is deciding where they want to go and what they want to do, it's not college or, maybe, off in the corner over here, there's this thing you might try, this weird thing you might try.
Mhm.
Um, we actually start looking like the career preparation systems of most other countries where there's college, sure, and anyone who wants to go to college, let's make sure we can support that pathway. But there's other alternatives too. I was talking to a woman who's involved in the Canadian apprenticeship
Mhm.
system. And I was talking, about how do young people get connected to the Canadian apprenticeships. And she kind of looked at me like, what do you mean? How do they get connected? When people meet with their counselor in their high school, the
Mhm.
counselor asks them, "What do you want to do?" And if they name anything that's in the apprenticeship realm in Canada, then I say, "Oh, well, then you need an apprenticeship," and I set them up with an apprenticeship. So they're very, very focused. The entire sort of Canadian post-secondary preparation system understands apprenticeship has this key role, and if you're interested in any of the skilled trades, or you're interested in hairdressing, or the many other trades that are now in the apprenticeship system in Canada, then you're going to go and you're going to get an apprenticeship because that's how you get prepared for that job. Um, and that's ultimately, what I think we're hoping for when we get what we would expect when we rise to the level of apprenticeship at more like 2 to 3 to 4 million people in the country.
So I like that target. I think that makes a lot of sense. Now the question is, what needs to change for us to achieve that?
Yeah. So of course we need some money. Of course we need the apprenticeship intermediary organizations like Apprenti. So those are two really critical building blocks. But the other thing we need to do is we need to make our apprenticeship system better and scalable. So right
Mhm.
now we've essentially designed a system that's pretty darn good for the skilled trades.
Mhm.
It works really well for them. Power to them.
Yeah,
We,
agreed.
got them to where they are right now. It's not so great for a lot of these other professions. You've lived this, right? As you've tried to work in other states where you're trying to get things registered, or even just the design of apprenticeship systems is somewhat complex.
State versus federal,
All of that.
all of it. Yeah.
So we have some work to do just to make the system a little bit more user friendly, where we're focused on outcomes, not processes, where we can streamline registration processes through building standards around particular occupations. There's a lot that we can do just to make the system run better, and to make it more user-friendly for employers and for apprentices alike.
So what's the appetite? And where are the roadblocks?
Yeah. So, well, you certainly know, Jennifer, we just had a big development in national policy. So the White House, President Trump just signed an executive order that makes it the policy of the United States that we should grow our apprentices, not fully to our eightfold increase, but up to 1 million new apprentices by the end of the Trump administration. We think that's a huge commitment for the organization, for the country. And so by declaring that goal and by asking, the Departments of Commerce, Labor, and Education to work together to achieve that goal, we think we have an opening in the administration to really start driving towards growth. We also know that in Congress, they fight about every single thing that is that's put in front of them, except apprenticeship. And that is the one place where Republicans and Democrats can come together. There's a variety of ambitious public proposals sitting with Congress. It's hard to get things through Congress, even when everyone agrees that they're a good thing. So we have some work to do on that, but we have some optimism that in this Congress, or maybe in the next, we're going to see some significant legislative moves on apprenticeship. And then the other good thing that we're seeing is that, you could say, Washington, D.C. is just crazy. It's impossible to expect anything good to come out of it. But a lot of good is coming out of our state capitals. And so governors across the country are embracing apprenticeship. They're increasing, not as much as we need to have an increase, but they're increasing resources that are going into apprenticeship, prioritizing it as a workforce development strategy, and moving their post-secondary educational systems in that direction. And let me just say one last thing that gives me some cause for optimism around this. So for the last almost 10 years, we've seen decreasing enrollments in higher education. And some of that's driven by demographics. So it's just, we have fewer people of age ready to go in. But the other is the conversation we had in the very beginning, that young people are increasingly skeptical about college as a solution. They don't want to take on the debt. They're not clear that they're going to get the economic return or even the career return that they're looking for from college. And this has provoked higher education systems to think about what their role might be in redesigning some of their pathways to embrace apprenticeship. Now, I'll say most higher educational institutions, I heard the expression used, are in what's called a defensive crouch, right? They just want to hold on as long as they can to college for all. But a handful, I would say, the bold and the brave are starting to think about how they can have a role in expanding apprenticeship. And in particular, in Apprenticeships for America, we really see the community college as one of the key drivers for moving apprenticeship forward, both as providers of educational services to apprenticeship programs, but also themselves as sponsors of apprenticeship. And so we're very interested in that development. We've been working with community colleges to help them on that path. And I'll say one last thing.
Sure.
One way that I know I said that was going to be last, but it related is that in England, in France, in Australia, there is an increasing interest and in fact, substantial interest in apprenticeship degrees. And this is the combination of the college degree and apprenticeship. And so for occupations where there's there is serious schooling that's required, or maybe there's a regulatory requirement that you need to have a bachelor's degree. We think the apprenticeship degree is another pathway for growth.
Mm,
In the UK, I can say the apprenticeship degree is starting to eclipse the non-apprenticeship degree, and people like it. Because number one, you're earning a paycheck while you're in school.
right.
That's a pretty good idea.
Yep.
And number two, you have immediate application of what you're learning in the classroom. And so it's not all theory. You actually get to use what you're learning
Right.
right away. And then finally, it gives people a sense that as they are landing in occupations, that they've got a leg up on the folks that just focused on theory and then only now are starting to get to practice. So for all of those reasons, we think the higher education sector can be sort of shifted
Mhm.
to be more supportive of these experiential learning opportunities like apprenticeship. And we think that's going to be both in their interests, in the interests of their students, and ultimately good for the country.
So all really important information, and I agree with the majority of it. And I'm not here to
What do you
disagree.
disagree with? What do you
I
disagree with,
don't
Jennifer?
disagree. I just have very strong opinions about the
Really? I
idea.
hadn't noticed.
No, not me. Um, about the whole concept of a degree versus an apprenticeship,
Yeah,
mainly because while it's interesting for select fields in those other countries that are exploring them, to date, both in the United States, in the building trades who have used it, the idea of an apprenticeship, because it's multiple years, is their equivalent of the degree in their field. That's how it's perceived.
yep,
And then in Europe, to this point, it has been much the same way. The CEO of Deutsche Bank was an apprentice, not a university grad,
yep,
right?
yep.
And the idea
Although I don't know in that case, but oftentimes they ended up going to college later
at
on in
some
their
point,
career. Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know that he has, but I will say we reached out to these employers with the idea that we needed them to rethink that degree status, the paper ceiling, and some level of degree inflation because they're
Yep.
treating all jobs equally. What do we now say to an employer who says, "But you told me I don't need the degree, and we
Yeah.
agree, and we now have a certification that does it in this amount of time compared to this"?
Yeah.
So is it a degree or not a degree?
It's a very fair comeback, I think. And one thing we don't do in this country, but maybe should think about because other countries do it and make good use of it, is they have apprenticeship levels.
Mhm.
So there's a level one apprenticeship, and there's a level two apprenticeship and a level three apprenticeship. And so as you are moving up the ladder and needing additional experience and background, you can go back to school, so to speak, through an apprenticeship program, and that to me speaks to the kind of trajectory that you want to get to, and increasingly as you go up the levels, there tends to be sort of more classroom stuff involved, more theory, more stuff that reinforces your rise in the profession. But I will say, here's my answer to the general answer. So first off, we have a set of professions that are pretty rooted in four-year degrees, like
Absolutely.
education, right? So if you want to be a school teacher in this country, you pretty much got to have a bachelor's degree.
Yes.
And so that happens to be one of the fastest growing apprenticeship areas in the country. And it's because we have apprenticeship degrees that are helping largely the paraprofessional staff in schools, the people who are teachers' aides and so on, move into teacher roles. And without the teacher degree, they wouldn't be able to do that. The apprenticeship degree, they wouldn't be able to do that. And in nursing and a few other these occupational areas that are just very rooted in that four-year degree. But I do think that there are other ways to think about this. So, for example, engineering is a degree that has almost no usefulness unless you've actually applied it.
Mm-hmm.
Because engineering is a physical thing. You need to be like out looking at materials
You need
and
a CPA.
and a
Before you take that,
CPA.
you
If
need
you
a
haven't
couple of
actually
years
done
of
the
audit.
books for a
Right.
company and you've got a CPA, what good are you? You've just looked at it in theory. And so I think there are opportunities not only to expand apprenticeship, but frankly to make degrees better.
Mhm.
And so I think that's part of the conversation for sure. But I get the messaging is a little complicated, and we have some work to do on that.
I agree. I think there's a confusion around it. But I do like your idea about the tiering of the
Levels.
system. Yeah.
Yep.
And I think that could address some of it. And I think the other executive order around looking at accreditation systems will contribute to that because
Yeah.
we have done that work. We have attempted to do that work with higher education and struggle because they can't do a literal mapping to the on the job portion. And that is, of course, several thousand hours in the place where they're getting the bulk of the experience. But if they can't figure out how to accredit it beyond gen ed credits, it has not served the purpose of the degree that you're looking for.
Not at
And that I
all.
would expect if I was in an
Yep.
apprenticeship.
Yep.
So,
Yeah, this is this is there's that expression, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. What we see at Apprenticeships for America is that there are places around the country that are starting to move this conversation forward. But it definitely is not everywhere, and it's certainly not at scale. And that's the story of our field. That's the story of the work that we have to do.
so let me ask one final but very rich question now because of the comment you just made. You're right. There are many regions, states that are figuring it out for themselves. California has figured out a robust system. Execution
Yeah, some work. Yep.
needs
Okay.
a little work, but right idea. Um, how how do we get not just this administration, but government as a whole to understand that the lack of continuity is part of what pushes the companies away?
For,
And
for sure. Yep.
having 50 states do something 50 different ways is the fastest way to kill it, not advance it.
Yep.
How do we get that message across? And what is your recommendation for how to solve for that?
Yeah. No silver bullets here. I'm just going to say that's a very thorny question.
It is.
But here's at least a framework to start thinking about a solution there. We actually we actually think so. For those who are listening to this and don't know, we have this very convoluted apprenticeship system in the United States. We have states that have decided they're going to run their own apprenticeship systems, and then we have states that decide that they're going to let the Federal Department of Labor run their apprenticeship systems. Sometimes states recognize apprenticeships from other states. Mostly they don't. It's a very messy thing. And if you're a national employer or an organization like Apprenti, you're forced to deal with this mess of a system.
Not to mention all the other agencies that go with it in order to support the work, from the VA and voc rehab to workforce councils to funders, et cetera.
Right.
Now multiply that by 50 states.
50 states.
Yeah.
So here's a way to think about it. We think there is real value to having states have a very active role in apprenticeship. We think it's good for a number of reasons. Number one is different states have different needs. And their economies are different, and the key industries in those states are different. Number two, and this is the American governance story all over the place, there's value in having people try different things. And we learn from other people. We had the opportunity to get better at things, to watch somebody in another state. Oh, that looks like a good idea. I'll do that. Watch somebody over here. Oh, that's a terrible idea. We'll never do that. So there's some value in all of that. And because employment for most people is a local thing. And they go to work, they work for a company in a particular place, and they relate to a particular state. But there is value in a national framework. And in particular, we think one of the things a national framework should do is create standards for occupations. In the United States, we have this tradition where if you want to set up an apprenticeship, you basically start with a blank piece of paper and you say, "Oh, I'm going to be a technician in a factory, an electrical technician in a factory. Now I have to think through, okay, in my factory, what does an electrical technician do? It turns out there's a lot that electrical technicians in factories do across the country that's pretty much the same. In fact, you can probably count on 80% of that job being the same factory to factory to factory, state to state to state. And so to the extent that we can create standards around that, in Australia, I am told, because of the presence of these standards, you can register an apprenticeship on an app in 15 minutes. And in the United States, it can take months, even years, to work through the approval process. So we think there's a big role for the Department of Labor to create these national standards across the states. We think the other role of the Federal Department of Labor is to get states to work together. And to incent the use, the recognition across states of different state apprenticeship efforts. So one thing we've said at Apprenticeships for America is that a state that's not playing fair, that's not recognizing work that's happening in other states, well, that's fine, but you don't need to get any federal funding for your apprenticeship system, right? We have levers that will create incentives for states if we wanted to use them that way. So there's work to be done in that space, but I do think that the framework of states working, at what they do best, and the federal government working at what it does best, and getting some clarity around that can address some of the challenges that we see in this crazy, patchwork quilt system that we're currently operating in.
Well, I would agree with that wholeheartedly, in that we 10 years ago got feedback from the tech sector saying the Department of Labor's expectation is 500 companies will file 500 programs for developer. And the industry went, no,
what?
Don't do that. Why would we do that?
Yeah.
The job looks the same whether you're, JP Morgan Chase, Amazon, or Intermountain Health.
Yeah.
If you're a software developer in Java, it 80%
we know what that looks like.
How we use it.
The 20% might be really important, and that does work. You have to have the flexibility to allow for that. But for most jobs, that 80-20 rule is a pretty good rule.
It's a pretty strong rule. And getting federal government to understand that nuance and to shift the focus to the outcome has been a bit of a Herculean effort.
Yeah, for sure.
But the state issue that you raise is an equally strong one, but also one where that reciprocity across state lines doesn't apply to any facet, including the funding. Because if you remand it to the states, there are 597 workforce boards.
Yes.
And the challenge that we struggle with as a purveyor and implementer is that the cost of making somebody be a software developer is the same in Mississippi as it is in Chicago.
Yeah.
Whether I train the person in Jackson or I train the person in Chicago, the cost is the cost.
Yeah.
The problem is, because it's a less expensive market in Mississippi, they think everything is less expensive and that you only need this much money where Chicago needs this much money, when in the reality, everybody needs this much money.
Yeah.
And so therein lies the biggest issue. How do we resolve that continuity issue? Because it isn't just the standards, it's a funding mechanism. If you give it to 50 states or worse,
for sure. 597
workforce boards, it comes out 597 different ways. Not including the incongruity of their own implementation.
Yeah. And I should just say, I was meeting with an apprenticeship program, and they were talking about all their funding. And then they mentioned, and we have some WIOA funding. That's our last money in. And I said, last money in, you mean that's the money that fills in the gaps? And they said, no, that's the last money we ever want to take. So we do everything we can to deliver a program that we don't have to take our WIOA money. And so, yes, I think that's definitely an issue we face. But our answer to that is honestly to create a formula-based funding system that's administered nationally, and something we call pay for apprenticeship. It essentially says that an organization like Apprenti should just, for every apprentice that you work with, you should be able to count on a certain amount of money that's just going to come through once that apprentice is settled in their job. And And if we had that, and by the way, we've done this before. We
Mhm.
called the Pell Grant. We've
Right.
done this in many different cases, and it definitely works to streamline systems, create expectations, build that ecosystem of apprenticeship intermediaries that we know we need to see, solves for some of the funding gaps that exist in our current system, and gives you some continuity, some sense of continuity that year in and year out you'll have access to that funding, and then you can plan. You can start investing in your program. You can, as both employers and apprenticeship intermediaries like Apprenti can do all that.
Well, and I think the big one, as we've seen with some of the funding we've received, is that ability to do the long-term planning. This is, my long-term planning is 100% contingent on my employer planning, right?
Right.
And when employers have longevity of certainty to the funding, then they can start doing multi-year planning, which is what
Yep.
we discovered with the Good Jobs Challenge funding that we
Yep.
received.
Yep.
And it proved exactly that outcome. We now have years of funding leading to years of planning, but now that funding is drying up and there's nothing behind it. And we have years of planning where companies are not, they're going to move headcount because this is not a fully employer funded model. This is not a government funded model. It's a public-private
Yeah.
partnership.
Blended. Yep.
And until there is that tipping point, most of the employers, doesn't matter what industry or sector, have a belief that it's still a bit of an unproven quantity. And as a result, they're paying the wages, the benefits, they're providing the mentorship, and they're committing to the minimum term of a year, at least in our case, in some
Yeah.
cases longer. And they're like, and we're going to pay some of the training, but we expect a government support to that. And we know full in the ROI is there for the
Yep.
government.
Yep.
But
That's
we
exactly.
have
Yep.
not seen the consistency of the dollars flow under any administration.
No, no. Even, we've substantially increased the investment in apprenticeship, basically tenfold in the last 10 years. It needs another 10 times.
Hundredfold on that and sustained.
And then sustained. Right.
Right.
Right. So we don't ask.
Only a few $billion by comparison.
It's only a few $billion. Yes. I'm in Washington, so I get to say that.
Right. I'm in the other Washington. Trust me. It's a few $billion to our budget at the federal level is finding pennies in the sofa.
That's it. That's it. Yeah. So, I think, we don't ask the college down the street to think about how they're going to raise money for their freshman class, right?
That's right.
We don't ask them to do that. We have systems that are designed to provide the student aid and support and institutional support that enables them to operate. We need to have a similar funding approach in apprenticeship if we're really going to scale this thing. Yep.
I'm in 100% agreement. Thank you, John. I appreciate
Thank you.
it today. Is there any last words of wisdom you'd care to share?
No, we're in an exciting period. We have an administration that wants to see apprenticeship move forward. We have a Congress that Democrats and Republicans are interested in working together on apprenticeship. And we have states that want to move their apprenticeship systems forward. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here. We just now need to organize ourselves around it.
Hear, hear. Thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate your time.
Good talking with you, Jennifer.
Cheers.